Welcome to Global Alliance for Tibet and Persecuted Minorities. This is Tsering Pasang. Today, I'm very delighted to be joined by Mr. Burzine Waghmar, a distinguished scholar and expert on South Asian and Central Asian affairs at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London. At SOAS, Mr. Burzine Waghmar holds affiliation with this SOAS South Asia Institute, London Middle East Institute, Center for the Study of Pakistan, and Center for Iranian Studies. He is also the school's librarian for South Asia and Indo-Iranian languages. His reading and research skills on the history, religions, languages, and cultures of the Silk Road cover ancient Xinjiang, Tibet, and their interactions with Iran and greater historic India and their dialects and communities along the Irano-Pak, Sino-Pak, Arpak borders, that's Balochistan, Trans-Karakoram Tract, Gilgit-Baltistan, and so on. Mr. Waghmar's linguistic and historical researches focus on Tibet, East Turkestan, during the first millennium AD and their trans-global interactions. So welcome, Mr. Burzine Waghmar.
Thank you, Mr. Tsering. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. You are a historian, and China claims that Tibet has been a part of Chinese empire since the ancient time. Are there any grounds for China to make such claims? And also, as historian, please enlighten us whether this historical claim has any basis or base.
Sino-Tibetan interactions have occurred in history, Mr. Tsering. That is a given. But for Chinese officialdom, as it has since 1949 portrayed a picture of contrived history, forced history, and exaggerated claims, has no place in serious, sober scholarship. That must be stated very much so at the outset. And we state that, at least I am doing so today, knowing fully well 7 decades of Tibetan occupation, given that 7th October 2020 marked 7 decades since the People's Liberation Army forcibly came into eastern Tibet and surprised an unarmed, ill-prepared Tibetan army of a de jure de facto independent state, running since 1912 when the 13th Dalai Lama had proclaimed the Tibetan kingdom as a distinct unit, a sovereign unit at that. So that must be stated that 7 decades on, we still are where we are, and things are actually getting worse, which I shall come to later. But first, may I foreground my remarks with a historical sketch. Well, Tibet is an exonym, as outsiders call the plateau in question, which is, of course, also known as the third pole or Asia's water tower. It has been known as a Tibetan Autonomous Region since 1965, which is, of course, a complete travesty, since the Maoists have not exactly conferred any autonomy at all on Tibetans and or what passes for Tibetan leadership, who are just stooges of the regime. And what exactly is this Tibetan Autonomous Region that the Chinese talk about and which we see on our school atlases or even on the internet? The TAR actually, Mr. Tsering, and this is very important to drive home, is only Outer Tibet as we know it since the 1914 Anglo-Indian Sino Conference of Simla, where the McMahon Line was drawn up. So this is ironical, if not hypocritical, that the Chinese do not countenance the McMahon Line, as they have repeatedly told India since Nehru's days, but the very Tibet that we see on atlases or on Google Maps is purely Outer Tibet today. That passes for the TAR. So what exactly then again is Tibet, you ask? We must distinguish between what is cultural Tibet, or the greater Tibetan ecumen, and political Tibet. What is political Tibet is what existed pre-1950 as ruled by the Dalai Lamas. Since the fifth Dalai Lama fused the role of, well, church and state as we know it in one incumbent, and that is unique about Tibetan Buddhism, which I'll come to too, monastic hierarchical rule. But that is political Tibet. Cultural Tibet, of course, encompasses not just this outer Tibet under Chinese vassalage, but also those provinces, historically, linguistically, ethnically Tibetan-speaking regions that have been locked off by the communists after 1950 and fused into Chinese provinces of Qinghai, Sichuan, Gansu, and Yunnan, to say nothing of Kham and Amdo of eastern Tibet, which have been completely written out of history when they should not have been, so to speak. Northeast Tibet, that is to say. So these are the regions which constitute Tibet, but there's more to it than that, Mr. Sering. There is also parts historically of Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, and across this belt of what is northeast India. That is, again, historically, culturally, southern Tibet, and we oughtn't forget that. May I also point out that Bhutan's state religion is Tibetan, Lamaist, Vajrayana, Yellow Hat sect Buddhism as we know it, which is, of course, the official credo of the Tibetan Empire, or what was the Tibetan Kingdom until 1950. And Tibetan Lamaist Vajrayana Buddhism is also practiced by Russian Buddhists, the Buryats, for instance, and the Mongols. And the Mongols have played a very pivotal role in Tibetan history, and the Tibetan Lamas looked to the Mongols to provide them moral leadership, and in turn, of course, the Mongols recognized their spiritual leadership and role too, which was, of course, I intend to come to also in a moment. Now, Buddhism comes to China, Mr. Sering, around the Eastern Han Dynasty era, that is from between AD 25 to 220. But Buddhism actually comes to Tibet in 764 AD. So much for Chinese claims that Buddhism, Tibet, and China go hand in hand since time immemorial. Far from it. Sino-Tibetan interactions on the Buddhist front only occur after the Sui dynasty, which is about, say, give or take around 587 to 618 AD. And of course, there is much that is made about the claim of the Chinese princess marrying the Tibetan sovereign's son, and as if that set into motion the whole ethos of Buddhism in Tibet. Well, again, like I mentioned at the outset, this is contrived history, a forced artificial reading, which has been straitjacketed to suit Chinese ulterior motives. But what really happened is this, that the ruler in question, Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty, was in conflict with the Tibetans. And in order to placate the Tibetans, I repeat, to appease them, because the Tibetans had the force of strength and the upper hand in question, Taizong dispatched his niece, Wencheng Gongzu, to marry Songtsen Gyalpo, the then Tibetan ruler's son. This occurred around 640 AD. But again, I must re-emphasize, and I'm sorry to sound repetitive, this was done by the Tang Sinitic rulers in question to placate the Tibetans, not to introduce or usher Buddhism to them, as it were. That is very important to point out. And that brings me to the question of the Tibetans, who could definitely hold their own in Central Asia, and they were a formidable military force. When the Tibetans enter world history from 636 AD onwards, and the Tibetan Empire, as we speak, which lasted up to 841 and which caved in subsequently at that time due to climate change, financial bankruptcy, among an assortment of reasons. And the Tibetan Empire also stretched as far west afield as Samarkand in today's Uzbekistan, is something your viewers might care to note. And the Tibetans also overran the Tang capital, Xi'an or Chang'an, in 763 AD at one point. That also needs to be pointed out. So it's not a question of the Tibetans being consistently under the Chinese yoke. There have been times when the Tangs did colonize the Tibetan plateau, it is true, but every so now and often the Tibetans revolted. And what is interesting in the Central Asian dynamic of politics during late antiquity is this, that the Tibetans and Western Turks were always in cahoots, joined as forces, resisting the Chinese incursions into Central Asia, which they deemed to be their natural domain and not that of the Chinese. So there we are.
Thank you very much for this wonderful explanation, and it reminds me to ask the next two questions. Here it is. Obviously, 1951 7-point agreement. I would like you to touch on that. And the second thing is, why is China in Tibet? What are the main reasons that led China to invade Tibet and resettle its Han citizens, Han Chinese, into Tibet and in the Buddhist world, Tibetan Buddhist world?
This is a Han Chinese mental block, Mr. Sering, and there's no other way of putting it. And by that, I mean this. The communists after 49, October 49, but also the nationalists from 1912 to 1949 may not exactly agree on anything, as we know. They've been far apart since then. And of course, the PRC and Taiwan. But there is a point of convergence between both nationalists and communists, that Tibet belongs to them. And now this is nothing but Han Sinitic chauvinism and colonialism doing the talking. There is no other explanation for it. That they somehow feel that Tibet is their natural quarry, as they do believe for Xinjiang or East Turkestan too. So, and I say this, Mr. Sering, for the simple reason that one may look at the communists as villains in the set piece, the current scenario unfolding in front of us. True, but do not for a moment think that the nationalists who made it to Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek and his cohorts, hold more liberal or more humane views of Tibetans. Far from it. They do maintain too that Tibet ought to belong to China, no questions asked. That is something Tibetans in the diaspora need to be reminded of. It is an uncomfortable fact, but I need to drive that home. Do not for a moment think that the nationalist Democrats sitting off the mainland in Taipei are more sympathetic to what has happened to the Dalai Lama in question. They do hold notions of a greater historic China in their mindset too, as it were. So, as I pointed out earlier, after 1912, the 13th Dalai Lama, who died in 1933, present His Holiness's father, if you recollect, got rid of the Chinese armbands of the political commissioners and definitely set about having Tibet as a de facto, de jure independent state. I grant you it was not recognized universally because it wasn't such a scenario with the world just looming towards war as it did 2 years later in 1914. True, but it still was its own state. It had its own unique culture, language, script, flag, and the like. And there is every reason to believe that despite the British invasion of 1904 and the forcible introduction of British consulates and diplomatic legations in Lhasa and elsewhere, there was movement, there was some interaction, Anglo-Tibetan interaction, which was positive, and there were Tibetan secular intellectuals, particularly those in Darjeeling and Kalimpong, who had seen what British India was and were curious and interested in, shall we say, opening up to the world. And of course, granted, a conservative clerisy did rule during this time, but we do have some modernity coming into Tibet. So it's not that it was completely a backwater as the communists like to tout after 1949. And speaking of Tibetan society and its so-called pre-modern aspects, Mr. Sering, Tibetan women always neck to neck in terms of gender equality and parity in the socio-economic spheres with men. So much for the Marxist claim after 49 that they liberated women from a feudal, aristocratic, clerical ridden class, as it were. Nothing of the sort. And even the Tibetan peasants, yes, there was an aristocratic Tibetan class of priestly scholars. And yes, there was a Tibetan peasantry too, but the conditions were not as acute as they were in mainland China, which Mao saw and wanted to uproot with the coming of communism. It wasn't as bad in Tibet as it was, say, even in India, British India, or in China in the 1930s and 20s, and elsewhere across Central Asia. So that puts paid the so-called Chinese allegations, which are nothing but falsehoods against Tibet, that it was a medieval backwater. Now, to come to the question of why the Chinese are in Tibet, well, they look upon it as a buffer zone, just like with Xinjiang. And of course, again, just like Xinjiang, they deem it as part of their frontier, which they need to protect from external aggression. But along with that notion comes the fact that they also look upon it as a colony to exploit for its minerals and resources. In the case of Tibet, as I mentioned, it is Asia's water tower. And at least a good 6 rivers emanate from the Tibetan plateau, Mr. Sering, which means 46% of South and Southeast Asia's lifeline depends on what flows from the Tibetan plateau, which again means about a good 20% of the world's population. Make no mistake about that. That explains why Tibet's strategic positioning has always lured invaders. The British were, of course, very skittish at the beginning of the 20th century, lest the Russians Tsarist Russia make incursions into it, which led to the invasion, but also with arrangements and the conventions that were set up between London and Lhasa, especially the one in 1914, as you know. And then, of course, there was this interim period when it was independent. And then the Chinese invaded because they felt it was their natural quarry and claim to take over Tibet, as I mentioned, when clearly nothing is of the case to be seen. Now, just before we proceed with the next bit, Mr. Sering, on the question of the Dalai Lama and monastic rule, which is very unique to Tibetan Buddhism. Now, this monastic rule by incarnation, where the Dalai Lama is deemed an incarnation of the Avalokiteshvara, that comes in about, say, and the very title Dalai Lama, the honorific, which means ocean of wisdom, comes in from 1578 onwards. But why do I mention this, Mr. Sering? Well, because Dalai is a Mongolian word. It means ocean, which rendered the sense of ocean or bounteous wisdom. And Lama is, of course, Blama as a teacher from Tibetan itself, classical Tibetan. So Dalai Lama is a Mongolo-Tibetan term. And, Mr. Sering, this is important. The term was conferred by the third Mongol emperor, Altun Khan, on the third Dalai Lama. And this was the title conferred upon the third Dalai Lama in 1578. Why is that important? Because it was the Mongols who conferred this title, not the Ming dynasty, as Chinese textbooks would have us believe. Again, a patent falsehood which is paraded and touted by the Chinese. And according to the Mongols, who obviously ran the Yuan dynasty 1271 onwards, Tibet and China were both satellites of the Mongolian Empire. They did not distinguish between both vassal states. So for the Chinese to claim that somehow China conferred the whole concept of Dalai Lama monastic rule onto Tibet is nothing but nonsense. That needs to be put to bed. So I need to point that out, and particularly after the fifth Dalai Lama, Mr. Sering, between 1617 to 1682, this monastic rule has been instituted and continued up to 1950, when the 14th Dalai Lama, His Current Holiness, was installed. And it is between 1617 and 1682 that also the Potala Palace was constructed on the hill. And it was very particularly done, Mr. Sering, in order to show a fusion of church and state, and that this was of strategic importance, the palace in question, as a spiritual moral repository to which all Tibetans looked to, even those in, like I said, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, and Northeast India, as it were. So I just wanted to point this second bit out with the Dalai Lama and the political implications that the Chinese may wade into the debate by bringing in some nonsense about the Ming emperors and this and that, when nothing of the sort is true. It comes and emanates from the Mongolian aspect of things, not the Sinaitic aspect.
Thank you very much for this touching on the Dalai Lama subject, because this is where I'm going to ask the next question. So staying on the same subject. Now, China doesn't believe in religion. Especially the communist China doesn't believe in religion. Having said that, the Chinese leadership wants to appoint the next Dalai Lama. Now, do they have the right to appoint the next Dalai Lama?
Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. First of all, if you are a self-styled godless regime and you're very proud of the fact that scientific socialism and atheism is what you project yourself to be as a regime, then why are you wading into matters of theology which have no concern for you? Why do you feel that the Dalai Lama ought to come back from Dharamshala to Beijing to conduct talks? Why do you think the Dalai Lama cannot conduct talks in any other city of the world, and that you absolutely insist on his coming to Beijing? Who gives you the right to appoint the Panchen Lama as a stooge in 1995 when the last incumbent passed away in 1989, and you removed Chinese state security forces, removed the child in question who had been appointed into the job, and he's disappeared from global sight. In fact, he made news, Mr. Sering, in the early 90s as the youngest held political exile hostage in the world. Almost a child, if not a teenager, was being held as a child prisoner, if you will, by the Politburo in Peking. And then they go and appoint a new Panchen Lama. And after the hiatus, they point him out, they project him onto the world stage in 1995 as this is the Dalai Lama, the new Panchen Lama. I'm sorry, nobody's buying it. Even if you put him into talks with the Singapore minister who was visiting Beijing and as to show him as some ornamental figurehead, it is a disgrace. So, as the Dalai Lama has rightly said, Mr. Sering, and this is important to drive home again, the next Dalai Lama can be appointed outside Chinese-controlled Tibet, option number 1, or the post of Dalai Lama may be rescinded. His Holiness has said that on record, including the latter, that the post may be revoked, in fact abolished, given what current circumstances are, and it may well come to pass, as it were.
Thank you. I have a few more questions. Now, as you know, China has always tried to, destroy the exiled Tibetan institutions or organizations. For example, Tibetan Youth Congress is one of the largest Tibetan NGO, which claims over 35,000 members, and it advocates for complete independence. And even the current Sikyong, the president of the Central Tibetan Administration, he was once member and youth leader and of the Tibetan Youth Congress. And when he assumed the presidentship or Sikyongship of the exiled Tibetan administration, the Chinese have tried to label him as someone who worked for a terrorist organization. So what do you think? I mean, why are they trying to label Tibetan exile institution as terrorist organization?
Well, they do so precisely because to coast along this so-called global war on terror that has occurred since 2001, and to portray any and every element that is against the communist regime in Peking as a terrorist, and to tar brush them with those colors. You will recall I pointed this out in the first session which we conducted on Xinjiang too, that the Chinese will, in this case, not just cherry pick individual Tibetans or Uyghurs, they will actually implicate an entire population en masse wholesale as terrorists. When I'm sorry, that simply doesn't fly, and nobody's buying it on the global stage, and particularly with Buddhists in question. That needs to be pointed out too. I mean, yes, there have been some Uyghur terrorism incidents that have taken place with the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement and with the Kunming riots and so on and so forth. But there have been nothing of the sort which have taken place with bombs going off in Peking, put in by Tibetan so-called insurgents or guerrillas. So that's, again, arrant nonsense that the Politburo likes to project. If anything, Ms. Sering, one notices Buddhist monks and nuns being whipped and beaten with batons, and even and who consequently go and immolate themselves. So people who burn themselves to death are not exactly terrorists, according to the global definition of terrorism, if not the global definition of morality, something which Peking ought to realize. And to consider every and any Tibetan group, and so many of them have left after March 1959, in the wake of the Dalai Lama's exile, self-imposed exile, only begs further uncomfortable questions of the Politburo. Well, why did about 100,000 odd leave with His Holiness on the night of 17th March 1959? Could it be because they saw what was coming to pass? Considering that between 50 and 59, so much for Chinese claims. After the 23rd May 1951 so-called 17-point agreement, which was signed under duress and which the Kasha cabinet never really got to see to scrutinize with the National Assembly in question, but which had to be done by the Chamdo governor, Gawang Jingwei, in question. It was the autonomy and the freedoms mentioned on that document are not worth the paper they were typed on upon. Because progressive communist infiltration took place, a complete erasure of all Tibetan officials, Tibetan aspects from public life took place. And then what happened, Mr. Sering, just before the Dalai Lama left and the disturbances broke out in March 59? Well, Mao's Great Leap Forward occurred from 58 to 60, which caused famines across China, not to mention Tibet too. And conditions deteriorated, living standards deteriorated there and as well as in Xinjiang, as we know. So it was just abject poverty coupled with an autocratic rule that compelled so many to leave in the wake of the Dalai Lama's fleeing to India, which is why so many did leave in the first place. And even worse was to follow after 1960. Particularly with the full force of the Cultural Revolution from 66 to 76, when the Chinese went about deliberately, maliciously destroying every and any aspect of Tibetan heritage which was more than a millennium old. Monasteries, murals and paintings, tankas, scrolls, sacred texts, translations of texts even from classical Chinese into Tibetan, not to mention precious texts from Sanskrit, Mongolian, Sogdian and other languages. I mean, it was a wholesale destruction. And I will even go on record to state what the communists did between 66 and 76 puts ISIS in shade in what it has done in terms of iconoclasm recently in the Middle East, particularly with the museums in Syria and Iraq. I mean, the communists were there long before ISIS came on the scenario. So let's not forget that too. Just as the Nazis indulged in book burning in the 1930s and the communists claimed to be anti-fascist, well, what exactly did they do in the 1960s in Tibet if not go around burning precious silk scrolls, texts and the like? Communists always talk about placing an emphasis on culture and artistic heritage. Well, I saw none of that during that decade, which practically destroyed everything of a Tibetan heritage, only some little that could be salvaged outside Tibet and which is kept going still as we know. I mean, Tawang Monastery in India, Arunachal Pradesh, is the second largest in the world after Potala Palace. And I dare say it's at Tawang where we can find, at least academics can find manuscripts which are not available to them at, say, Potala after the destruction that has been ensued. And to top it off, now the Tibetans parade Potala Palace as a so-called museum just to bring in tourists and show the world that everything is noble, when clearly that is not the case in Tibet.
Thank you very much. Before I come into Tibet-India border clashes, I would like to ask you one thing which was covered in and published in a range of international medias recently. For example, Reuters reported that China is pushing growing numbers of Tibetans, rural laborers, off the land and into recently built military-style training centers where they are turned into factory workers. Which mirrors like a program in the western Xinjiang region that, was actually recently discussed in the UK Parliament as well. So can you explain what is China trying to achieve from such program in Tibet?
A sinicization, in a word, Mr. Sering. And I'm glad you pointed that out because it reminds me again of the Great Leap Forward in 1958, which Mao instituted and enforced across Tibet. Not only forced collectivization of agriculture took place across the Tibetan plateau, but what's the basic aspect of Tibetans, Mr. Sering? They're not exactly sedentary, they're nomadic as a people, and forced settlements and residency was imposed upon Tibetans in the late 50s and 60s. So again, by doing this, by press ganging Tibetans into labor as they're doing now in internment, as we see now, and that was discussed in the British Parliament recently, precisely goes back to the policy of destroying an integral feature of Tibetan life. Because Tibetans take to the nomadic life. They're not necessarily sedentary as a people. And that is what they're trying to do by forcibly settling them where the state deems they ought to be settled and telling them where they ought to live and how they ought to live. So what we see is, of course, happening because of cheap labor for public sector firms that the communists want to run in Tibet. Slave factories, pretty much. But again, there's a pattern to it because they want to destroy an integral, cherished aspect of the Tibetan psyche and ethos, that is nomadic living, by forcibly settling them down where they deem they ought to be settled down.
Thank you. Recently, the foreign minister of the British government, after various MPs tabled and expressed their concern about what's going on in Tibet, and even this cultural genocide is taking place in Tibet. And some years ago, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has also said that some form of cultural genocide is taking place in Tibet. Now, this foreign minister, he said that if there are concrete evidence of such taking place in Tibet, then the British government would look, although they would take the allegation seriously, but when clear evidences are presented and the British government is willing to take necessary action as per the UN Convention. So would you like to add anything on this?
Yes, let me just straight away point this out. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And insofar as evidence goes, there is enough responsible, legitimate evidence available to show what China has been doing, not just in Tibet and Xinjiang collectively. And in both provinces, it more than merits everyone to ban the Winter Olympics of 2022, Mr. Sering. I need to state that, and I do so with full force of my scholarly authority, that it is incumbent upon London, as there have been some moves recently in certain circles, there has been discussion to the effect that Britain ought to ban the Winter Olympics, and indeed, it is morally incumbent upon other countries to do so. Chancellor Merkel has taken a stance on the Uyghur question with Beijing, as we know recently. I suggest, and she stands out in Europe as being a singular figure to do that and not kowtow out to the Chinese and their so-called BRI investments, which are nothing but white elephants in any case. But that's another discussion for another day. But the point is, she has stood out for the Uyghurs. I propose she even speaks up for Tibet, and both Britain and Germany should take a collective stance on this and boycott the Olympics in question.
Thank you. Now, I would like to go to the recent clashes between India and Chinese troops on the northern part, especially on the Ladakh side. Would you like to give us a sort of scenario what has happened there recently?
Well, Mr. Sering, essentially Aksai Chin is going to be a fait accompli for the Indians, because the Chinese National Highway 219 passes from Xinjiang into Tibet, and it crosses the Linzitang Plains through eastern Aksai Chin. It goes, shall we say, from northeast to southwest of Aksai Chin as a curvature and enters into Tibet. I do not see the Chinese obviously compromising on that with the Indians, that's for sure. And of course, in no mean measure, this is due to India's lethargy and, of course, India's mealy-mouthed attitude since the Nehru administration in forcibly confronting the Chinese on these matters, which has led to this scenario that is unfolding before us. And on that point, if we're talking about India, permit me to quote what Lord Curzon said in 1905 at the March Calcutta Conference. With his characteristic bluntness, Lord Curzon said this: I would, quote, I would not budge a single inch and would personally sacrifice all hope of a convention with China, to which I attach the minimum of importance, than yield to them, close quote. And also, Mr. Sering, since we're doing quotes, the American minister, W.W. Rockhill, at the start of the 20th century, was a noted expert on Tibetan affairs. And he was a distinguished traveler and scholar and authority on Tibet. And this is what he said to Lord Grey, the British Foreign Secretary. Quote, there is a sort of tragic interest in observing how the Chinese government, like a huge anaconda, has enwrapped the unfortunate Dalai Lama in its coils, tightening them upon him until complete submission has been extorted. The history of the whole transaction enforces once more the moral which seems the natural one to be drawn from the British expedition into Tibet, that the chief result of that expedition has been to immensely strengthen the hold of China on Tibet, making it now almost a province of the Chinese Empire, and so which may one day become a formidable military power against India. Close quote.
Thank you very much. Before I ask you to give the final remarks, I want to ask this, because recently, I think around the time of this border clash between Chinese and Indian troops, Tibetans from various parts of the world have been asking and raising these three matters. India to recognize Tibet as an occupied country. Secondly, recognize the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala as the Tibetan government in exile. And thirdly, support Tibet's independence, which will help to secure or settle the border issue between India and the Chinese side. Would you like to make any comments on this?
Yes, I should very much like to plunge right away into it, Mr. Sering, with this. If India fancies itself as a superpower or a regional superpower, then with great power comes great moral authority, and India ought to exercise it, particularly since it fancies itself as the world's largest democracy, and an accountable democracy and a polity at that. It is entirely correct of India. New Delhi ought to recognize Dharamshala, which again reminds me, in 1956, Mr. Sering, 3 years prior to the Dalai Lama's fleeing to India permanently, to Dharamshala, His Holiness came to India to attend the 2500th Parinirvana celebrations of the Buddhist celebrations that were globally held in 1956. And Peking had given him permission to travel to India for that. And at that point, he had met Prime Minister Nehru, and he sought some advice or counsel, if not support from him, which was shamelessly not forthcoming. And if anything, Nehru told him to accept Chinese jurisdiction, and that to stop clamoring for independence or any such autonomy, which of course in times to come would occur, because the Chinese mean well. Well, nothing of the sort has happened, and we know what Chinese good intentions always lead to. So it was tragic, if not outright regrettable of Nehru as a statesman to state that. Because 3 years later, of course, he had to flee, as I mentioned, in March 59. And you mentioned about the British minister in question talking about evidence a few moments ago. Well, it now occurs to me, as I said, there are reams and reams of evidence available of gross violations and deaths and murders happening in Tibet. Well, what happened immediately after the Dalai Lama left in March 1959? According to Chinese military intelligence reports and the Peking's official documentation, I quote, 87,000 Tibetans were killed between March and October 59. So much for asking for evidence of what's happened and what has not happened.
And I was asking about this, whether India should recognize and support Tibetan independence.
India should recognize Tibet de facto and de jure Tibet, the Tibetan kingdom, under monastic hierarchical rule of the Dalai Lama as a polity, which existed from 1912, the summer of 1912 to 7th October 1950, and which was destroyed by the incoming People's Liberation Army. It was an unwanted aggression by any definition of the UN Charter, and despite El Salvador being the only country in the world, Tibetans who are watching this in exile may note this, Mr. Sering, as a passing remark I make as a historian. El Salvador, in Central America, mind you, was the member state of the General Assembly, and they brought the Tibetan question on the floor of the General Assembly that here naked aggression has taken place against an independent state, and would the General Assembly convene a discussion of the same? Both New Delhi and London, to their eternal shame, did not let that occur. By trying to assuage the Security Council and the General Assembly, that's quite all right. We will sort the matter out with the Chinese, and all will be well for the Tibetans. Well, they didn't sort out anything with the Chinese. They only kowtowed to the Chinese in question. So it was deplorable that this could not even occur. And the entire question was never really brought up at the Security Council as such.
Okay, I still want to ask one more question now. This is very interesting. Now, at this time, we are seeing a growing shift in the global attitude towards China. I think that presents both challenges as well as opportunities for the Tibet movement. Is it now time India and its allies stand up and raise the Tibet issue in the United Nations?
Quite right. It has to be raised, even if the People's Republic of China is a member of the Security Council as one of the P5. Even if it is so, it can still be raised by India, by Western Europe, by the Americas, that is to say both Canada and the United States, and by South America. If a small country like El Salvador could do this in 1950, Mr. Sering, a tiny country, what is to stop greater powers with more resources and a more forceful voice like India and others to speak up on that? A voice that was not heard back in 1950 can be resuscitated again. And this is no time to be letting up on the Chinese administration. Mind you, our anger, or shall we say our objections, are towards the Chinese regime, not the Chinese people in mainland China or across the Chinese diaspora worldwide. It is against this very repressive regime, which has never really reflected the aspirations of the Chinese Han people in the first place. Never mind non-Chinese minorities like the Tibetans or the Uyghurs. So we must point out that our struggle is against the regime in question, which is a reprehensible regime on any and every count and against any parameter since 1949.
Thank you very much. And I will give you a few minutes to make your final remarks.
Well, if I'm permitted a personal observation to wind up, I would say this, Mr. Sering, from what I've noticed as a distant observer of matters. As I said earlier to you, I come to it as an Iranist, someone who does Iranian studies. I'm not a Tibetologist or a Sinologist. But in seeing the situation unfolding before myself, it's regrettable, if not outright tragic, when I notice Tibetan youth in the diaspora. And youth are what they are, restive and angry and impatient, true, no doubt. But in certain quarters, I find them personally lashing out at His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama in question, by saying he's useless, he's been incompetent, and has done nothing for us or for the Tibetans in the last, 7 decades. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. I think it's absolutely shameful. It is an utterly uncharitable remark for them to make, which they make in as hot-headed youth, not knowing what has occurred prior to their arrival. I mean, they're just about in their teens or in their 20s, and they don't know what has ensued in the last 70 years, as it were. His Holiness has been a moral force to be reckoned with, as recognized by the 1989 Nobel Peace Prize. And that was the greatest impetus that could be given to the Tibetan struggle by putting the voice of Tibetan consciousness on the global stage and the global map and in public consciousness. What happened after he was awarded the Nobel Prize in October '89, if you recollect? His Holiness has been not just a pacifist force, but even a force for coming to terms with the Chinese government. Not to mention so many overtures that he's made by saying that he's willing to relinquish independence provided genuine autonomy is actually conferred upon Tibetans to conduct their own affairs and their lives, both public and private lives. But nothing has been forthcoming from Peking on that. And His Holiness, as you know, Mr. Sering, back in the 50s, could not, in principle, as a Buddhist, support the guerrilla forces in Kham, which were, of course, the Tibetan renegade forces, which were fighting for Tibetan, not just independence, but to preserve the Tibetan way of life in the late 50s and 60s, because he could not, in principle, as a man of God, give impetus to violence. That flies in the face of his cherished ideals. And I do not expect him to do that as a religious head. So for a Tibetan youth to take pot shots at him as they do, as I've heard recently and read recently, is absolutely uncharitable and shameful. I mean, what do you expect Tibetans to do in downtown Lhasa? Fight with sticks and stones against a behemoth, a communist behemoth, with the latest weaponry at its disposal? What do you expect him or any other Tibetans to do? It's all very well to pontificate, an armchair talk being conducted in the comfort of one's security and leisure, far from the scene, in exile, wherever you may be. But it's simply not on, as far as I'm concerned. It's plainly unwarranted.
Thank you very much. As we speak, actually, Tibetans in diasporas are very much actively involved in democratically elected Sikyong, which is the president, and also member of parliaments. So lots of discussions, online discussions are taking place around the world. Because of the COVID, the gathering is almost limited or not permitted in certain countries. So Tibetans are actively pursuing in this democratically elected Tibetan sort of leaders. And this democracy was introduced by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He wanted to make reforms inside Tibet, but that could not happen because of Chinese invasion of Tibet.
Exactly.
And later on, when he came into exile, he's introduced democracy. So Tibetans are very much enjoying and exercising, although we are still very much young, but we are learning and making mistakes at the same time.
And
So
Mr. Sering, when you point that out, as you've just done so, here is a religious head of state giving impetus to secular governance. That is also interesting to see. He is not coveting power for himself. He is not cornering power for himself or the Lamaist councils in question. He is actually telling Tibetans to stand up and to take a stand in public life, organize themselves, and to be politically active. And in so doing, it is something worth noting that here a religious head of state is giving impetus to secular rule. And he has no compunctions or objections in so doing, which only lends luster to His Holiness's standing, as far as I'm concerned, as a non-Buddhist.
thank you, Mr. Burzine Waghmar. It's such a pleasure to have you. Recently, we talked about the China's colonization of East Turkestan, and today we talked about China's colonization of Tibet, and it's much appreciated. A British historian, expert on the subject or expert on these regions. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Sering. All the best.